Hey everyone, I'm Melissa Erdelak, host of the Gluten-Free Recipe Challenge podcast and creator behind the gluten-free website Mama Gourmand. Here we take beloved recipes you thought you'd never enjoy again and transform them into easy copycat versions just as good as the originals. So when I was about 10, my mom decided to go back to work after a lot of years staying at home with 6 kids. And what was her big escape from all of us? Becoming a children's librarian at a public library. She was and is an excellent cook, and my dad was and is not. But Mom had to work in the evenings, and we had to eat, and we definitely weren't looking at Dad for any sort of help in that department. So the solution was frozen dinners, which were a complete waste of money. I basically licked every divided tray clean of the instant mashed potatoes and the brownie, and then I threw out the chicken drumstick and the corn. And then the other meal I loved was the pot pies, but I only ate that crust that was like soaked in the cream sauce because I found the chicken to be very suspect, and who eats veggies when you're 10? Also, side note, none of this shit would fly in my house now, starting with frozen instant mashed potatoes and ending with throwing out food. So today we're going to talk about a gluten-free chicken pot pie that is the antithesis of 80s microwave meals. This recipe has gotten a ton of 5-star reviews on the site, but the comment I hear the most about it is that my non-gluten-free family absolutely loved it and they had no idea it was actually gluten-free. The first component that makes this recipe great is the crust. I use my flaky gluten-free pie crust recipe, which I will link to in the show notes page. And I also go into more detail about on episode 2 if you want to take a listen to that. If you want to use a shortcut though, you could use store-bought gluten-free pie crust, but homemade is best. And if you don't believe me, go back to the beginning of the show where I described my dad's dinners. So I pour the filling in a pie pan and then I just top it with an upper crust, but you can make this a double crust pot pie as well, which would obviously be doubly delicious. And for the filling, we don't use canned soup, but it's still really easy. The hardest part of it is just the chopping. You have to chop some celery, carrots, onions, and cooked chicken. Or you could use rotisserie chicken. And I have complete faith in you that you can handle the chopping. So to begin, preheat your oven to 375. You're going to melt 4 tablespoons of butter in a large saucepan and then add in the vegetables, which are chopped onions. I use a half a medium onion, 2 chopped carrots, and 2 chopped celery. And then just saute that for about 7 to 8 minutes or until the veggies are crisp tender. Then you sprinkle gluten-free flour over that. You need a half a cup of gluten-free all-purpose flour. You can use any gluten-free flour for this recipe. It's just for thickening purposes. Also sprinkle over 1 teaspoon of salt and 1/4 teaspoon of pepper and just cook and stir until the veggies are coated with flour. Then reduce the heat to medium-low and slowly pour in your gluten-free broth. Just so you know, read your chicken broth labels carefully for gluten-free. Swanson's I know is gluten-free. I use the Aldi organic brand, which I also know is gluten-free. So pour it in, about a half a cup of it at a time, and then just keep stirring continuously. And you're going to keep pouring it in. You need a total of 1.5 cups of chicken broth. Once the broth has been added, continue stirring while you add the whole milk. You will need 2.5 cups of whole milk. For this recipe, I recommend using whole milk for the best consistency. If you want to do a dairy-free recipe, I'll go over that at the end too. Once the milk has been stirred in, then also add in 1 teaspoon of dried parsley and a half a teaspoon of dried thyme. You want to bring that to a boil and then reduce the heat to a simmer for about 2 to 3 minutes or until it's very thick. It will get extremely thick, which is fine. You want it to hold up in the pie pan and make it easier to serve. Then at this point, you'll stir in 4 cups of cooked chopped chicken and then a 2/3 cup of frozen peas. Now your filling's done. You pour it into a 9-inch pie pan and then set that aside while you roll out your pie crust. If you're making homemade pie crust, I personally love and use, I have this OXO, it's a silicone pastry rolling bag, so it's in the shape of a circle. You unzip it and put the dough in the middle and then roll it out, and it doesn't stick to that. It's really easy to pick up and transfer to pie dishes, and I will link to that as well. That makes rolling out crust so much easier. So once you have your crust rolled out into a large circle, so you want it slightly larger than the top of your pie dish, then remove one side of the parchment paper off the crust and invert it over onto the filling, and then you peel off the bottom piece of parchment. Gently press the dough so it sticks to the edge of the pie dish and turn over the edges to flute it. Then, to make the top really shiny, I whisk together 1 egg with a little bit of water, and then you just brush that over the top of the pie crust. And the last thing you're going to do before you bake it is you need to cut some slits in it so the steam escapes as it bakes. So just use a sharp knife and cut about 3 slits into the top, and then bake it for 35 to 40 minutes or until the crust is golden and you start to see the filling bubbling through the slits. Then you know it's done. Okay, some other versions of this pot pie that you can make instead of the onion, celery, carrot, pea combination, you could chop up whatever leftover veggies you have and add them to the cream sauce. Some other vegetables that would be good would be mushrooms, leeks, corn, or even diced potatoes that have been partially cooked. If you want to make a vegetarian pot pie, I would increase the amount of vegetables and then just omit the chicken. And then, of course, substitute vegetable broth for the chicken broth. And you can also replace the chicken with turkey. You would just use 4 cups of leftover turkey. If you want to do a gluten-free, dairy-free pot pie, then substitute a dairy-free milk alternative, such as almond milk or soy milk. I will say that the filling won't be quite as thick because it doesn't have as high as a fat content. And then you will replace the butter with plant-based butter sticks as well. If you go to the recipe, then you will also find the tips for freezing this, reheating it, or doing a make-ahead dinner. So remember, you could find the full printable recipe on the show notes page. To get to that, click on the link provided in whatever podcast app you're listening on, or go to my recipe website, which is mamagourmand.com, and click on the podcast tab. And there you'll find the full recipe along with any ingredients or equipment I've mentioned.